You may begin.
Okay. Good evening and welcome to the League of Women Voters of the Hamptons, Shelter Island, and the North Fork program, a panel we've entitled the Electoral College and the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, What Every Voter Should Know. I'm Kathy Kenny, who along with Kathy Peacock, co-chair the Government Committee. We are so very fortunate to have with us this evening 3 distinguished law professors as panelists who clearly have the credentials to help us understand this issue. We have Derek Black, professor of law at the University of South Carolina School of Law. He's the Ernest F. Hollings Chair in Constitutional Law and an expert in education law and policy. He directs the Constitutional Law Center that focuses on education and voting. He has written 3 books. His most recent, Schoolhouse Burning, explores why public school education is essential to democracy. He has written some 70 law review articles, chapters, essays, reviews, and policy briefs on topics that range from civil rights to the fundamental right to education. Rebecca Green teaches at William & Mary Law School in the areas of election law, legislative redistricting and GIS, privacy law, and alternative dispute resolution. She has authored some dozen law review articles on various topics, including the Electoral College, candidate privacy, counterfeit campaign speech, and redistricting transparency. In addition, she has served as a panelist and invited speaker on, by my count, some 57 different occasions on topics ranging from transparency in elections to voting rights. She co-directs the Election Law Program, a joint project with the National Center for State Courts, aimed at providing resources for judges deciding election disputes. And finally, we have Bruce Ledowitz, a professor of law at Duquesne University School of Law, who teaches in the area of state and federal constitutional law and jurisprudence, specializing in law and religion and the secular. Professor Ledowitz is co-director of the Duquesne University School of Law's Pennsylvania Constitution website, founder of the Allegheny County Death Penalty Project, co-founder of the Western Pennsylvania Coalition Against the Death Penalty, and served from 1985 to 1990 as the secretary of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. Professor Ledowitz writes a biweekly column on public affairs for the Pennsylvania Capital Star. He's the author of 4 books, including a forthcoming book from Oxford University Press that will be published next month. The Universe is on Our Side, Restoring Faith in American Public Life. So you can see that we now have the dream team with us tonight. Welcome and thanks for joining us. In an article written by the historian Professor Alan Guelzo of the National Affairs, he stated, and I quote, "There is hardly anything in the Constitution harder to explain or easier to misunderstand than the Electoral College. And when a presidential election hands the palm to a candidate who comes in second in the popular vote, but first in the Electoral College tally, something deep in our democratic viscera balks and asks why." So with that background, we'd like to explore exactly what the Electoral College is, its purpose and its pitfalls, and then make the same examination of the National Popular Vote Compact Initiative. So let's begin simply with an explanation of what the Electoral College is and what the Founding Fathers had in mind in drafting this process. Professor Black, I thought I might throw this one over to you.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the Electoral College is a reflection of that founding skepticism, to be quite honest, of common people, right? And so we talk about ours as being the first constitutional democracy, extending the vote to regular folks, although regular folks would have been defined as white men with land primarily at that point, but nonetheless, turning it over to those individuals. But that was a scary thing for more powerful individuals. And so the Electoral College operates as a check on that ultimately, rather than turning the presidency over to individual voters, it would be turned over to the electors from the several states. So that check in between, and they could vote as they saw fit. Now, there's also the interplay, which most of us do know a bit more about, which is the unevenness of how those votes are allocated, right? So that the small states are disproportionately represented in the Electoral College, given the way they're divided up, and that also sort of gets us into Senate questions that I won't get to now. But that's it in a nutshell, right? That sort of skepticism as to how and in fact, right, most people may not know that we used to not elect senators either, right? And so that was actually changed by constitutional amendment so that now the senators are directly elected by the people. So,
Well, how are the electors selected by the states?
well, I will say, you know, the technicalities of that are probably answered better by some of my colleagues. I don't actually know the answer of how they select the individual persons. Maybe Rebecca or Bruce can help us out with that.
Anyone want to take that up?
Well, I think the reason that it's hard to answer is that it's a little bit different in every state, and it tends to be driven by political parties as opposed to some sort of institutional appointment. And well, you know, I mean, it ultimately is an institutional appointment, but it tends to be sort of strong partisans in the state who can reliably vote for the elector, the people put forth. But it is a different and kind of I guess, organic process in each state, depending on how the structure operates. I don't know, Professor Leidowitz, if you're familiar, particularly in Pennsylvania. I have had a student actually who served as an elector, but I never asked her how she got that. She was just plugged in politically, but I didn't really ask the mechanics of that. I don't know if you know in Pennsylvania.
I don't know the mechanics of how the parties select their slates, but the important thing, of course, in a winner-take-all state, as most are, is the slate. And so to understand the Electoral College and understand its alternative in the Interstate Compact, you have to think about the slate of electors, all the electors for one candidate or the other of the two major parties in most cases.
In New York, most of the time, very frequently, it's a legislator. It's a political party, somebody running for election that wants some exposure and that kind of thing. Do any of you think that the Electoral College violates the one man, or I should say one woman, one man, one vote?
Well, that's certainly, I think, what Professor Black was referring to, because the Electoral College votes are allocated according to your congressional delegation, the number in your congressional delegation, and that, you know, means that, you know, the numbers of people who are represented in the Electoral College votes are wildly different. And of course, one person, one vote was a court-imposed rule from the 1960s that dealt with state legislative and congressional districts. So it was never sort of meant to apply in the presidential election sort of context. But I think the impulse behind one person, one vote is that everybody's vote should have equal weight. And so when you have these very unequally weighted presidential elector votes, Electoral College votes, I think that kind of rings, it's problematic for the same reasons that the court, imposed the one person, one vote standard in the districting context. So I can see why that would upset people, especially from states that are disempowered because of it.
Right.
I'm sorry.
And as Rebecca would agree, it's really the U.S. Senate as a whole which violates the spirit of one person, one vote in a very, very large and important way.
You mean that because the small state has two senators and the large state has two senators?
So let me jump in, because I mean, Bruce went where I was going to go, but one step further. So actually, in the one person, one vote cases, Alabama had actually defended itself and said, look, because there's a series of them. How can it be that there's something wrong with the Alabama malapportionment of Senate seats when, in fact, the United States Senate is malapportioned? And the response to that, the court gave it, is ultimately, the distinctions within an individual state are arbitrary, right? Where the lines are drawn or not drawn are completely arbitrary, but the state lines, whether we like it or not, are not arbitrary. And I'm not trying to defend them, but it was part of the deal that makes a nation come together under the Constitution, right? That Rhode Island and states of that size really aren't interested in being squeezed in as just very, very small minority players in this overall system. So it does, as Bruce said, violate the one person, one role as a theory, but in terms of our constitutional system, many would argue it was a necessary predicate for it to come into existence.
Right. And It's also, it's sort of strengthened that the attack on Alabama. Derek, you can correct me, but as I remember, Alabama didn't have a system. They just didn't reapportion in violation of their state constitution. And so, they ended up with something that couldn't be defended on any ground.
Yeah, there's a great case from Colorado where the twist in Colorado was that the people of Colorado, by a direct democracy mechanism, tried to impose the same system that the federal government used. That is to say, a Senate-style malapportioned Senate, and then the House districts with equal proportion, or I guess that was the plan anyway. And the court explicitly said, for exactly the reasons that Professor Black outlined, that the only reason why it's allowed at the federal level for the Senate is because it was part of this compromise to form the union, and Colorado doesn't have that luxury because there was no such kind of forced compromise in that context, so that they were stuck with one person, one vote. But it was pretty incredible because that's how the people said they wanted to be governed, and yet they were told by the federal Supreme Court, tough luck.
That's amazing. One of you, I mentioned, or maybe both of you, and I think maybe anybody listening may not understand when you say that the selection of electors is weighted unevenly. So perhaps somebody can explain that.
Well,
Go ahead.
it's the congressional delegation, and thus the 2 Senate rule is, among other problems of redistricting, but primarily the 2 Senate rule is weights the electors since they represent the congressional a group of representatives from every state.
Well, that might bring us to my next thought. According to most recent census figures, there's a push to in population shift from the Northeast and Midwest to the Sun Belt. So we're kind of wondering what impacts that might have on the Electoral College. I mean, I'm making presumptions about what's happening, but
We're in Pennsylvania, we're all hoping for additional climate change until people realize that Pennsylvania is the only state that's largely benefited.
well, let me just presume for the discussion that the southern states are more conservative than the Northeast. So my theory was if all the Northeast people go to the southern states, then they're kind of transferred their own viewpoints to those other states. I don't know. There may not be enough, but.
Well, just to come back to the Senate for one moment and then go to that. So the problem is, I think Wyoming only has 1 person in the House of Representatives.
Right.
So they have only 1 representative, right, based upon their population. But since the original compromise gives everyone 2 senators, they actually get 2 votes for their senator. So you have this small state, right, with small population having 2 Senate votes, 1 in the House, whereas California still only has two Senate votes. So that's the malappropriation there. But the population shift, and maybe because I'm a Southerner and I'm just biased, I'm less worried about that. Ultimately the population shifts will follow, the apportionment based upon population. So if more folks come to South Carolina, yes, we're going to get another seat, but those folks are coming from Pennsylvania and New York and other places. And so, our states are becoming purple at the same time, right? Apparently Michigan and places like that are becoming purple as well, right under our eyes. So, the sort of movement and population shifts seems to me what it's really doing is averaging out some of our political differences across the nation rather than creating a new problem. But that's my perspective on it.
Well, but what's interesting about that, Derek, is that because of the winner-take-all nature of the Electoral College, it's discrete. It's not gradual. If Texas turns blue, the Republicans will not elect another president. So, it's discrete in that sense. Obviously the reverse also, if California turns red, the Democrats won't elect another president. So, the winner-take-all nature, it makes all these gradual changes very discrete and sudden when they finally bite politically.
You had mentioned in one of your articles, Professor Ledowitz, that you talked about ALEC, the American Legislative
Ah,
Exchange Council. Do you want to bring up that at this point?
well, it's a terrible story, and I'm sorry that more people don't know it. It's not. It shows one of the problems with the Electoral College, which is the discretion that it gives the state legislatures. Now, I've criticized the compact on that ground, that it's a creation of the state legislature, but at least the compact is serving a democratic purpose. What happened earlier in the 21st century was a conspiracy. I think it's obvious that it was. ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, proposed ostentatiously, it's closely aligned with the Republican Party, proposed going to congressional districts for the winner take all rather than winner take all at the state level. But the conspiracy, and if that were done, in 48 states, that wouldn't change very much. But the conspiracy was that Florida, Texas, reliably Republican states made no movement in that direction whatsoever. Obviously they understood that this was not for them. They remained winner take all. It was aimed at states like Pennsylvania. And the conspiracy was that if purple states that would have temporary Republican dominance, like Virginia did at the time in Pennsylvania, if they went to congressional districting, the effect would be to not submerge the Republican vote in those states, because they would win. The Republicans would win some of those congressional districts, but the Democratic vote in Texas and Florida, for example, would remain submerged, and so the result would be a tremendous advantage for a Republican presidential candidate. If purple states adopted congressional districts and red states remain winner take all, it would give Republicans, could give Republicans permanent possession of the presidency. It was foiled by patriots like Tom Corbett, Republican governor of Pennsylvania, who said, "Don't mess with the Electoral College." Now he's always denied. He teaches at Duquesne, and he's always denied that he did this. But he's a hero, and he just doesn't want to embarrass his party. But people like that, and Virginia Republicans as well, scotched this plot. But it certainly could have been done. Because the legislatures have this authority, and the Electoral College is so peculiar because it doesn't give us any uniform a way of electing anybody. I mean, the system that we have right now is not really the system that it looks like. It's just happened to have been arranged that way. It could change tomorrow.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Is what you just described in Virginia and Pennsylvania, that they would give a proportional number of, they would essentially, they would appoint presidential electors by congressional district, depending on who won that congressional district? Is that what you were getting at?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, just want to, I didn't know if people understood that that's what you meant by congressional districting.
Well, so that's what they do in Maine and Nebraska.
Right. And
I was wondering, suppose all of the states did that, though.
yeah, see, if all the states did it, the effect would be very similar to the winner take all system we have now. No, the plot was that Republican states would remain winner take all. And it was a plot. It was, because if it hadn't been a plot, then Texas would have had hearings also on moving to congressional districting for electors. And of course, everybody understood that they were not to do so. I mean, it was unbelievable.
And there's nothing.
And it almost worked. It almost happened.
Well, and I was just going to say, there's nothing to stop.
There's nothing to stop it.
Mm-hmm.
I would just jump. I mean, to me, and this goes to whether we're going to an interstate compact or the problems that Bruce and Rebecca are pointing out. I mean, to me, this is a rule of law problem, because part of what rule of law means is sort of consistency, predictability, whatever the given rules are. You don't begin playing with them because you don't like the result. Now, if we want to amend the Constitution, that would be great, right? We could figure a better system. But when ultimately we have disparate actors, trying to enact disparate rules to achieve their political end, that's the problem, right? I mean, I'm generally speaking, okay, as long as we all know what the rules are and we all play by them fairly. And as I read Bruce's very insightful piece that he shared with us in advance, right? To me, that's the sort of takeaway, right? Is that once we start messing with the system, although I didn't know about the plot that he was describing, it becomes entirely unpredictable, and it's not being done for any reason, any principled reason other than just pure political power. And that seems to be a race to the bottom, unfortunately, when we do that.
While we're on that,
Hey, Derek, that's terrific. I think the next book of recent American history should be called Race to the Bottom. It describes a lot of what's going on.
It's very sad.
since we're talking about that, I thought we switch over to faithless electors. When Trump met, I think it was the Michigan electors or legislators, I was appalled. I said, how can they change their vote? So evidently, I think they can. So I'm going to throw this over to Professor Green because I think it's it's a little frightening to me issue. So would you just explain for those listening, what do we mean by faithless electors? Became prominent in the last election. And I guess the question is very simply, can an elector change his or her vote and disrupt the election? And what happens if an elector fails to vote as directed?
Yeah, this is one of those questions that I just love about studying law, because you just kind of smack your forehead and think, how could this not be settled already?
Yeah.
We've been here for 245 years, and with these very basic questions are still not settled. But basically, there's all these state laws, and some states don't have these laws that direct electors to vote in a certain way. And there was a case decades ago where the question before the Supreme Court was, can a state require an elector to pledge an oath to vote for a certain candidate? So it was sort of like, can states bind electors? And the court said yes, but it did not answer the question of whether if a person took a pledge and then changed their mind after taking the pledge, whether a state could remove or replace that elector. And so the person who is pledged or otherwise sort of expected to vote for one candidate and then decides to vote for another candidate instead that's what's known as a faithless elector. It's an elector who defects from his or her pledge to vote for the candidate that was the popular winner in their state. And this is sort of a sleepy question over the course of US history. Not many faithless electors have switched their votes. But in 2016, we had this extraordinary situation where there was a huge lobbying campaign. There was a change.org petition and, tons of hate mail being sent to electors who, were used to being in the shadows in previous cycles, but who were very much thrust into the limelight, where there was just this huge outcry that they should defect and vote for someone other than the popular vote winner of their state. And more electors did in fact defect in 2016 than in any election previous. That gave sort of rise to this question, and it happened in two states where the outcome was different in terms of how the courts in those states looked at it. Can a state constitutionally remove or replace an elector who defects, or must they accept that defection and report that to the Congress as the electoral vote of the state? So it's this really interesting question of, what is the extent of state power over these electors, or are they sort of these independent, free thinkers who can kind of vote their conscience in extraordinary circumstances, which is arguably sort of the design of the Electoral College in the first place, that we have this sort of layer, as I think Professor Leitowitz suggested, of sort of a check and balance in the system, sort of to prevent sort of the popular masses from making a mistake. I think the specter of foreign interference in 2016 and sort of the extraordinary nature of Trump as a candidate, had a lot of people thinking that the time was ripe to sort of think about whether or not that check should be employed. But in any event, these two different outcomes in two different states Colorado and Washington brought this to this sort of, it wasn't exactly a circuit split because one of them was a state court, but it brought the question to the Supreme Court, which had to decide whether or not the state legislature kind of controlled, or whether these faithless electors were in fact independent actors with their own authority to vote their conscience. And Justice Kagan wrote an opinion the June before the 2020 election, saying effectively that states could in fact bind faithless electors, or they could replace and remove or punish or do whatever they wanted to stop faithless electors from having their votes recognized. So that issue, whether or not you like the outcome, at least it was settled before the 2020 election, which was tumultuous enough even without that issue being on the table. So for those of us who would have liked to see even less chaos than we did see, it would have been something else if we threw the faithless electors into the mix.
I wanted to ask Derek, after Rebecca's discussion of conscience, when I was growing up, I just assumed that the Electoral College met and that it talked about who would be the best president, and that's what was envisioned. I didn't find out till years later that they never met. So, to what extent is this a myth that they were sort of just supposed to decide who would be best as president?
Yeah, I think the more we go through this conversation, we see that, times sometimes shape practice more than reality. So I don't know, right? It's sort of like there's this initial idea of a vision of these, Platonic, leaders, philosopher kings that would do things such as Bruce said. But, were there ever philosopher kings, serving in these positions to begin with? Because if it wasn't them, who are the non-political actors who are going to get together and act, in the best interest anyway? So I think what you're really highlighting is the amount of idealism that's sort of baked into our rules, but doesn't really exist in reality.
And never did. Washington was just an obvious choice. It wasn't really an independent, finding the best person. It was sort of the only choice at the time.
Well, I was looking before we got on, like you, things that we didn't know just earlier today. I didn't realize that Adams was so far short of them. It wasn't even a close election, and Adams becomes the second president. So that was a shock to me as I began to look back at that.
Well, given all that, does the Electoral College still make sense today? Keeping aside the alternative of the popular vote movement, does the electoral, and in other words, is there another solution? Or is there, what I meant is there a way to amend or straighten out the mess that I'm going to call the Electoral College right now? Is there a way not to eliminate or abolish it, but is there a way to ameliorate some of the problems that exist?
I have to say that aside from the question of the compact and the national majority vote winner, the most dangerous thing, as my story about ALEC and the plot to steal the country shows, which by the way I've referred to many times, and no one has ever disputed that that's what was going on in 2012, 2013. So I think it's true that it was a plot, and it almost succeeded. So I think the most important thing we could do, and you don't need a constitutional amendment necessarily to do it, would be to take away the power or the inclination of the state legislatures to have separate systems. And I think Congress could take the lead in trying to persuade, Congress cannot directly order the states to all adopt winner take all, and to have that be baked in as the system. Because as Derek said, at the moment, whatever the faults of the Electoral College are, it's not predictable. It could change any time. And we really at least need that everybody be playing by the same rule book. Everybody be winner take all, everybody be by a congressional district. It doesn't really matter as long as it's a universal. And the people who defend the Electoral College are not actually defending the power of the state legislatures to come up with some cockamamie scheme.
Mm-hmm.
They defend the Electoral College the way it is now. So I think in a way, you could say, well, then let's make it more the way it is now and make sure it's baked into the now. And then we can worry about, the popular vote initiative.
So it wouldn't be an amendment to the Constitution. This would be would it be a law that Congress would
Well,
pass?
Congress cannot order the states to pass a law, but Congress has many arrows in its quiver that can help it convince the states. And also the people of the United States are not aware of the way that state legislatures can fool with the system. So a concerted effort by Congress to lead, to create incentives might very well have the effect that's necessary. And it would be great to have all the states sort of agree by compact that they will stay with winner take all and not try to game the system, which is, the worst of all worlds.
I saw an old congressional hearing back in the 70s where several, it was funny to see some of them because they're still in Congress, but this is 30 years ago. And one of the suggestions that came out of that, and of course didn't do anything with it, was to create if there was an amendment to the Constitution, it would be to force electors to vote as the popular vote goes into their estate. So the effort is in there a while.
Can I put a couple of things on the table just to kind of get people thinking? People identify some real advantages to having an electoral college system. And I completely appreciate Professor Leitowitz's point about, uniformity and predictability would be a very nice thing, particularly when we have potentially aggressive state legislatures who want to use their Article 2 powers in ways that we're uncomfortable with, or Article 1 powers in ways that we're uncomfortable with. But I guess, if you think about the 2020 election and all of the recounts and, craziness in terms of, what the outcomes were in these sort of close elections, if you shifted to a popular vote system where every vote in the country literally mattered to that tally, you could imagine in a close election, right? You could imagine, just total mayhem in terms of trying to, get eyes on every single ballot cast in the country. So in that sense, that's one of the strongest arguments, I think, for maintaining a system like we have, because, at least you're concentrating. I mean, it's not great, right? Like in Florida 2000, no one had fun there, but, at least you're concentrating the problem into, certain places. And then the other big reason people say they like the Electoral College is that without it, you would just have politicians, presidential candidates going to large cities in populous states and campaigning there, and you'd really leave out, some of the other places in the country that might want to have more attention. So, I think it's important to put that on the table as you sort of think about whether a national popular vote or some system using a popular vote makes more sense, that there are, I think some benefits to having this very bizarre system in place.
And I'd like to just add to that, although, there's the offsetting problem that candidates never go to New York or California.
Right.
But,
For fundraising, they come here for
They come here to
fundraising.
fundraise. Yes, that's right. They do that. But I mean, the other thing is that because the Electoral College mimics the Senate in requiring this kind of 50-state strategy, in some sense, you have to put together a coalition of states. It can force a party like the Democratic Party in particular not to just run up majorities in New York and California, but to pay attention to, North Carolina and Virginia, and now Virginia is safely blue, I guess, but Georgia obviously being an example. So it really has the effect of building a national party in a way that a simple winner of the vote itself is not. I mean, it seems crazy, but in a way, if you win a lot of states, you're more of a national party than if you win the popular vote.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I mean, as I teach, each year through the Tilden Hayes election, and I tell students, there in my mind, which obviously is 130 50 years removed at this point, it would be impossible to determine, I think even at that moment in time, to determine who actually won South Carolina. That was the state in dispute in 1876 election. And that's because there was so much fraud and corruption. There was so much intimidation of African-American voters that even if you had the ballots, it wouldn't have told you who the true winner was. And so, although there was plenty of backdoor dealing, I'm not defending that, but the Electoral College is able to deal with that problem. And you can imagine now, right, if we had a system which was simply winner take all, then we've got enormous potential problems with, well, how are they running voting in Pennsylvania versus Texas? Because maybe Pennsylvania wants to run it up and they're going to let everyone vote on their iPhone, and Texas doesn't. I mean, it potentially creates this weird arms race and using the political electioneering rules to run up. It's not just about the campaigns, it's about the local people trying. And then you get some weird functions. It's sort of like, well, the Maine folks, they're decent. They're not going to do that. And so, they're not fairly represented because they're not pulling the shenanigans of some other state. And so, I mean, there is, again, as both Rebecca and Bruce said, there is some sanity to having some electoral voters involved here.
I would like to switch over to explaining and exploring the National Vote Interstate Compact. Before we do, in the interest of full disclosure, I have to say that the National, as well as the New York State League, some time ago endorsed the direct popular vote method, and they essentially said it was representative government and supports the abolition of the Electoral College. As I said, that was some time ago, and as I mentioned, it should be a factor here in our discussion because we really want to know what is the National Interstate Compact and what is it predicated on. By that I mean, is there a constitutional directive or foundation for that movement? So can somebody just briefly describe what the National Vote Interstate Compact is? I'll need to volunteer and explain if there is a constitutional directive or predicate for it.
Well, there is. I mean, there's no question that it's constitutional. I think Article 2, Section 1 allows the legislatures to create the method of selecting electors, and the compact, which does not go into effect by its own terms until a grouping of states representing a majority electoral college all endorse it, and they're close, but they may never reach that point. But in any event, the compact, the legislature adopts a law, so to speak, in which the certifying official, usually the Secretary of State, is told to certify the winner of the national popular vote. And so that you'd have in 2016, even though Trump won Pennsylvania, the Secretary of State would have been directed to certify the electors for Clinton, even though Trump won, because Clinton won the national popular vote.
Do you think there's a likelihood we'll have additional states? I understand that they have 195 electoral votes with the states that have adopted it. New York is one of them. They have to get to 270, so they're 100 votes away.
I think there's no chance because I think that the landscape has changed, so that now we have this is premised on this power I really don't like. Article 2, Section 1, legislatures select the method and in their discretion. And now we see Republican legislatures sort of feeling their way toward a rule in some states that if the legislature finds fraud, even if no court has, for example, in a presidential election in that state, then the legislature substitutes the slate they pick, which would of course always reflect the majority in the legislature. And this is frightening, but the compact ironically works along the same authority of allowing the legislature to direct the Secretary of State to pick the losing slate. So I think the fact that Republican legislators are talking about this has tarnished the purity of the idea of the compact. And I think now the idea that a legislature would direct the Secretary of State to pick the losing slate of that state sounds horrible to people all of a sudden.
I think the sort of the similarity really is that in both instances, the popular will of voters in the state is not being followed, and that, I do agree that, with the 2020 election, the kind of specter of that does seem a lot scarier than it did in previous elections, where the concern really was just that we had 3 recent elections where the popular vote winner did not win the election, and in all 3 cases it was Democrats losing to Republicans. So I think the politics of the National Popular Vote Compact have changed as these new sort of situations have arisen. So I think I agree with Professor Leibowitz that it's become less likely as we start to fear the role of state legislatures' direct power under Article 2.
Yeah. Conceptually, when you say it's the national popular vote, well, it sounds like, it's one man, one vote. But in the fine print, as Professor Leibowitz explained, it's anything but one man, one vote.
Because there's one thing that we haven't said. It just sort of strikes me that we obviously want the will of the people to be represented. I think we also have to think about like the lesser evils, and if what we could imagine is a predictable electoral college, right? I mean, look, I voted for Al Gore, right? I wish that he won the election. I was railing on the fact that I thought the Supreme Court illegitimately stopped votes from being counted. Let the votes be counted, right? How can you come up with any theory by which to stop the counting? But they stopped it. But I think, it's only 21 years ago now, but the rule of law held, right? And I agree that George Bush was the president, the rightful president of the United States, even if only by virtue of the Supreme Court not letting the votes be counted. Although we won't go into whether actually maybe he did win Florida. There's evidence there. But the real problem, it seems to me, at this moment in time is not, it goes back to this predictability. It's not the Electoral College, it's not something else. It is a movement towards tyranny. I mean, that is the danger. It's not that somehow the popular will is thwarted in what we've seen, because what we're really talking about are individuals who don't see real fraud. Right? You said it, right? They don't see real fraud. They just want someone else to be president. And they are willing to make up factual claims, make up ideas to maintain, under no rule of law, in my mind, someone as president. And that is moving completely outside the boundaries of the way this country has supposed to at least operate. That is tyranny. That is the direct thwarting. Rebecca said. I mean, that is a scary thought to me. Al Gore not becoming president as much as I want, that's not scary. Hillary Clinton not becoming president, that's not scary. Someone being gerrymandered in the middle of the night into the president, that is a scary thought because of the motivations that would bring it into existence.
Do you think that's what's behind this movement for a national popular vote?
No, but I'm just, it's going to Bruce's point, though. It's like, while we're talking about, national popular vote, all this other crazy shenanigans that are really scary are happening behind the scenes. And that's what I'm really trying to focus on.
And I think what the last, year has, or really just the last 6 months has demonstrated that we hadn't really thought of before, when you sort of think about the value or the advisability of the National Popular Vote Compact, is this idea that it compels the state legislature to go against the will of the people. And that's just, the specter of that has just become a lot more scary as we start to see, the idea of a legislature deciding that an election was fraudulent without evidence and, appointing a different slate than the people voted for. Right, that the specter of that is so scary that it makes, the well-intentioned national popular vote, more susceptible to, worry, I guess is the best way to say it. How powerful do we want the state legislature to be, and should we be taking steps to empower it when it could run amok?
Is there anything in the National Popular Vote Initiative that might address our problems with the Electoral College? I mean, is there any saving grace there?
Well, I think there would have been, it wasn't thought of as necessary. If the states that adopted the compact had done so by state referendum instead of the legislature, if the legislature had directed that there be a state referendum, then I think some of Rebecca's concerns would have been assuaged, because at least you could say to the disgruntled Trump voter in 2016 in Pennsylvania, well, we voted to go this way.
Mhm.
But that they didn't think that was necessary when this was dreamt up. We didn't have the craziness that Derek refers to that we do now.
And I also think that the further away you get from that vote by a popular vote, the less likely it's going to assuage voters when the legislature goes against their will.
Right. No, that's certainly true. It's interesting to think how many states, I know, New York, I suppose that New York voters would vote for the compact because it's a Democratic state and we still think that the Electoral College favors Republicans. But a state like Pennsylvania, I don't, if there were a referendum, I don't know which way it would go.
I don't either.
This is kind of off script, but there's this movement in several states, I guess. I think Professor Ledwich, you mentioned Georgia and Texas, that they're more restrictive voting access. And I wondered if, and it seems to be a Republican, I guess, does that play into this whole Electoral College / National Popular Vote mess? I mean, what is behind this restrictive voting access bills?
Well, I would like to hear Derek and Rebecca's view on this, because I think to a certain extent, now we have a different experience here in Pennsylvania because it was the legislature that created in 2019. And even people in Pennsylvania don't realize that. They think it was COVID. But the legislature created in 2019 no excuse mail-in voting. That was a Republican majority legislature that
Really?
created that system.
Huh.
And so I'm not sure how much voter suppression is going on, all the scary headlines, but I'm not actually aware that many of the states that are criticized for this, Georgia, Texas, Florida, have actually gone back beyond 2020. I mean, it's true that they've cut back a little bit on the expansions of voting, but I don't know that anybody's really cut back on voting. There's not much voter suppression that I can see, but maybe I'm being myopic.
Well, I guess it was the principle that some people are in uproar about it, but I heard subsequently, I'm trying to remember who said, it's really not going to affect voting that much. But I think it's the principle of it that upsets people.
I think there's a couple interesting things there. The first is, it's possible that uproar over, these sort of tightening of the rules in these states will actually, backfire in the sense that it will mobilize more people to, get out and vote because they're so furious by these restrictions. But I think the other really interesting thing about this is, so there was a case in Arizona where a couple of different restrictions that the Arizona state legislature imposed was challenged under the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And it went before the court, and there was this argument, and I won't get into the specifics of the standard for the Voting Rights Act, but this the lawyer representing Arizona in that case, at the very end, I think it was Justice Coney Barrett, who said to him, sort of, why are you, essentially she said, why are you pushing to restrict these laws? It was, that's kind of a simplification of what she said, but his answer was unbelievable. It was Michael Carvin was the attorney, and he said, well, these elections are close and every vote counts. And the implication was, if we can stop a few people from getting their ballots cast by, for example, preventing absentee ballot collection by, volunteers, then we're going to do it. And, that to me is why, even if these laws really aren't as restrictive as some of these Jim Crow headlines would suggest, the impulse behind them really seems to be, if we can just shave off a few of these votes, it may matter if the election is close. So,
No, I think it's true that it's so odd. The Republican Party seems to be the only political party in history where the leadership of the party doesn't believe it can win. They did so well in 2020 all over the place until President Trump took a hammer to the voters in Georgia. They did extremely well with all these expansions. And where did Republicans get the idea that the more people vote, the more they lose? President Trump actually said it, right? No Republican would win ever again. And it's crazy that they think this, because I don't think the facts bear it out at all.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I would add on the restrictions, I think, and this goes back to my time at the Lawyers Committee doing election protection, so it's a little bit dated, but what I saw having sort of the biggest effects are not the things that make the headlines, the rules in advance. It's really sort of day of resource issues. So, as long as there's some early voting, folks can get there, most folks can sort of figure out how to navigate that system, right? As long as there's a polling precinct in their neighborhood that's got, a sufficient number of ballots and enough workers, they'll do it, right? But what we have in some of our communities are, of course, the precincts change, the precincts are collapsed. These are highly problematic. And I remember in the Kerry Bush election, literally, and some of you may remember the TV screens of just like throngs of people in Cleveland, just as far as the eye could see, waiting to vote. And I was getting phone calls at the Lawyers Committee. And the best I can recall from that situation was that literally there were not enough ballots in Cleveland. And there was one woman, according to the precinct, one woman who had all the extra ones in her trunk. And she was driving them around on an as-needed basis within the city of Cleveland. This is a resource problem. It's not a rule problem, right? It's a precinct problem. It's not a rule problem. And that doesn't mean that maybe there aren't bad motivations, and Rebecca's right. But I think we don't have the sufficient resources quite often invested to make our elections run well. And for all the people complaining about, Georgia results not coming in quickly enough, it's like, it's humans, it's people power, and you have to have a certain number of people doing it. Otherwise it moves at that rate, and we don't, right? And it's a perennial problem.
We begged a group of scholars, and I'm sure, Bruce, you were one of them, was begging Pennsylvania, states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, to allow the processing of absentee ballots before Election Day, because it was going to take a long time, right? And just make this little administrative change, and it will really take a lot of the pressure off of your state. But they wouldn't change the rule, or they only changed it mildly in Michigan. And sure enough, there we have the chaos that ensued. But there are just little changes that can be made, smart decisions that election administrators can make and state legislatures can make about how elections are run that would really help.
Well, Rebecca, in the Pennsylvania instance, in that example, it's a good illustration of polarization, because there was a compromise ready on the table to be made, voter ID for changes of the kind you were talking about. And I think that Governor Wolf wanted to make the deal. There were indications that he did. And his party, my party, my party, it's not them, but the base would not permit a voter ID, even though there's absolutely no indication whatsoever that voter ID would suppress votes very much at all. And especially compared to these opening up mechanisms that the deal would have represented. But you can't make deals anymore, because the other side is evil, or that's the perception.
I'd like to get back to the national popular vote. If it was instituted, would all of the states have to have uniform requirements? Do you know?
I don't think so. I don't think that's part of the compact.
Yes. So it wouldn't really address the electoral, what some people would call pitfalls, the Electoral College, where theoretically an elector could vote as he pleased.
Well, it would render the electoral college essentially irrelevant because all of the electors would be required to, by joining the compact, you would be, binding the state legislature to appoint the slate of electors of the candidate that won the popular vote. So all of these kind of mechanical questions about how the faithless electors, operate, those all fall away because it's all keyed to the winner of the national popular vote.
Is there any way to amend the Constitution? I had read that there were a lot of efforts to amend the Constitution. I was surprised because, it's, I don't know, 180 bills. It was some big number. I'm just wondering, is there any way to amend the Constitution to satisfy the people that are pushing for a national popular vote initiative? It's surprising. I saw a piece in the Times, and it's in a letter Thomas Jefferson sent to Madison. He said that the nation should adopt a new charter every 2 decades. A constitution naturally expires at the end of 19 years. He wrote, this is in 1789. If it be enforced longer, it is an act of force and not of right. So you're all the constitutional scholars. So I asked this question, is there any way to neatly, and forget the party polarization, is there any way to amend the Constitution? Not to abolish the Electoral College, but to rein in some of the issues? Or if you had a pen, what would you do?
Well, I'm not expecting a constitutional amendment to be approved on any of these electoral issues anytime soon because of polarization. I mean, I don't even think it's possible. Even for something, that would only modify the Electoral College, like limiting the power of the state legislatures to select alternative methods, which would actually be in everybody's interest on a social choice theory. Everybody is at everybody else's mercy right now. But I don't even think that would be approved in a constitutional amendment right now, even though it wouldn't necessarily give any party any advantage.
I mean, this is why you have the national popular vote workaround, because there is no way to fix this via amending the Constitution because of the problems Bruce just described. I mean, it's just too heavy of a lift, and I don't think there's enough consensus in the country about whether the Electoral College should be abolished. So, the national popular vote was seen as this sort of workaround, and now I think there are some real questions about, as we've talked about, whether it makes sense to empower those legislatures.
Well, electing a president has become very interesting. As I started, the nuances of this are beyond my ken, but it's certainly your expertise tonight is so appreciated, and your time. I think you've given us a lot to chew on, if not to swirl around in our heads. Before closing, I would like to thank the Government Committee of the League for all their input, as well as CTV, of course, for agreeing to air our program. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Arlene Hinkemeyer and Andrea Gabor of the League for their instrumental, who were really instrumental in giving this program off the ground. Let me sign off by reminding audience participants that September 28th is National Voter Registration, and across the country, the League will be setting up registration tables, and you can find out where and the time by looking at your local publications. So if you're already registered, or you would like to change your party affiliation, this is an opportunity to do so. So I would like to thank the professors sincerely, because you really gave a very difficult, you gave every aspect of the issue, which was, to me, very interesting. And I hope it was to our listeners. Thank you and good night.